Hi, it's Miss Dunn here.
And Mrs. Reid.
We're just going to take you for a whistle-stop tour, this time of the Year 4 summer curriculum.
Literacy and language. Victorian newspapers. In our non-fiction literacy and language unit, we will be learning about newspaper texts from the Victorian era and broadening our knowledge of Victorian times by looking at and writing newspaper articles of the period. We have reading and writing targets linked to this unit. These are the reading targets we hope your children will achieve by the end of this unit. I can explore how different parts of a newspaper have different purposes, e.g. to inform and entertain. I know that newspaper articles have key features to make them easy to read. For example, headline, stand first, lead paragraph, and captions. I understand that adverts have a main message and use attention-grabbing language to interest the reader. And these are our writing targets. The final task of the unit is to write an entry for a class newspaper set during Victorian times. My newspaper entry includes interesting source material from Victorian times. It has attention-grabbing language and synonyms to avoid the repetition of words. It is well organised and includes at least one of the key features of newspaper articles, such as headlines, captions, or columns. In grammar, we'll use paragraphs to organise our information into longer articles. And this will include correctly punctuated subordinate clauses to give extra information. We will start off by learning why people read newspapers to find out about current news and events through their articles, adverts, and notices. Then we'll look back at newspapers from the Victorian times and find out why they read newspapers for the same reasons. Do you remember Hannah and John in our fiction section of the Runaway story? We read a Victorian newspaper extract telling us about how Dr. Barnardo set up his shelter in Stepney Causeway to save children like Hannah and John from the dreadful conditions of the workhouse. We're going to find out lots of things too. First of all, we're going to learn how to use dictionaries to check the meanings of the words we have read. There might be a lot of Victorian language that we're not that familiar with. We're also going to learn how to use a thesaurus to find alternative words with the same meaning. You already know what they're called, don't you? They're called synonyms. We're also going to familiarise ourselves with the key organisational features of newspapers, as I outlined earlier. We're going to look at adverts from Victorian newspapers and discuss which we think are the most successful ones and why. We're also going to look at modern day newspaper articles and see how we can edit and improve them ourselves. We're also going to learn how to use a page full of notes to turn into our own newspaper article. Our final aim is to use source material from the Victorian period to write a newspaper article for our own class newspaper. You may choose to write it on something like the Great Exhibition or any other major events of the time.
Thanks, Miss Reed. In numeracy, we are going to be concentrating on a concept called fractions. First question that we'll hope to answer is, what is a fraction? A fraction is an equal part of a whole. So for example, on the left hand side, I've got a whole apple, but the apple on the right hand side, I have eaten a fraction of. We will look closely at the vocabulary attached to a fraction because that helps us to understand what each part of the fraction means. So the bottom number in a fraction is called the denominator, and the denominator tells us how many bits, how many equal parts our whole has been broken into. The number at the top is called the numerator, and the numerator tells us how many of the equal parts we have left. We will look at unit fractions, which is a fraction with a numerator of 1. Then we have the unit fraction 1/4, and alongside it you can see the picture of a circle which has been cut into 4 equal bits, or 4 quarters, and one of those quarters is coloured blue. We'll take a look at non-unit fractions, and a non-unit fraction is simply a fraction which has a numerator that is bigger than 1. So here I have the non-unit fraction 3/4. See, I've got my circle picture again, and this time we're looking at the uncoloured portion of the circle. So again, the circle is separated into 4 equal parts, but this time 3 of those 4 equal parts are unshaded, leaving us with the fraction 3/4. We will then move on to looking at something called equivalent fractions. Equivalent basically means equal, so an equal portion of the shape can be expressed as different fractions. For example, in my diagram here, you can see in my first diagram I have a circle divided into 2 equal sections, and the section that's shaded represents one of those equal sections, so it represents 1/2. In my second picture, the shape is divided into 4 equal parts, so it's in quarters, and I've got 2 of those quarters shaded, which is exactly the same amount of the shape shaded as in 1/2. So 1/2 is equivalent to 2/4, and you can then continue that. 2/4 and 1/2 are also equivalent to 3/6. As you can see, the same proportion of the shape is shaded and are equal also to 4/8, and you could continue to break the shape down into smaller and smaller equal parts and see how many of those equal parts would be equal to 1/2. As if that wasn't enough, your children will also be working on adding and subtracting fractions with the same denominator. That's an introduction to the concept of adding and subtracting fractions, because the only number that changes is the numerator. The denominator will stay the same. Here's an example of how adding fractions with the same denominators work. So as you'll notice, in all of my numbers I have the same denominator, an 8, but I have a 2/8 and I want to add 5/8 to it, and the only number that changes after my equal sign is the numerator, which becomes a 7. Okay, here I've got a subtraction calculation, which is 10/12 take away 5/12. The denominator remains the same. I don't really even need to worry about it. So all I need to do is 10 take away 5, which is of course 5. Not done yet. We will also be taking a look into the world of decimals, because decimals can also be thought of as fractions of numbers. Many tenths are in 1, and then we will look at how to write those down using decimal notation. For example, 1/10 of 1 equals 0.1. We will also introduce the children to hundredths, and we will look at the fraction 1/100th as well as the decimal notation, and thinking about how many hundredths there are in a whole 1, and then looking at the decimal notation for 1/100th of 1, which is 0.01. In Year 4 Science, we have 3 topics remaining. We are going to be looking at states of matter, living things and their habitats, and sound. first question that we pose to the children, and one that we hope to answer throughout the unit, is what is matter? Matter is the particles which make up everything in the universe, including us, and depending on how it presents, whether it's solid, liquid or a gas, depends on how those particles act and move together. We will closely observe how matter moves between the three states of gas, liquid and solid. In the example of the kettle that I've got on the screen here, we will look at what happens when water is heated, which turns it into a gas as it evaporates. We will look at what happens when it's at room temperature. It will be a liquid, it will remain as water. And then we'll look at what happens when it is cooled to the point that it turns to ice. We will investigate the water cycle and have a look at the part played by evaporation and condensation, thinking about the associated temperature that's involved in the process of evaporation and in the process of condensation. So in the process of turning water to a gas and then turning the gas back into a liquid to water. In biology, we will take a look at living things and their habitats. Difference between vertebrates and invertebrates. A creature which is classified as a vertebrate is one which has a spinal column. A creature which is classified as an invertebrate doesn't have a spine or backbone. We will be exploring, grouping, identifying and naming a variety of living things both in our local areas and in the wider environments. And this is a very timely topic at the moment. We will be looking at how environments can and do change over time, but also be thinking about how this can sometimes pose dangers to living things. We will be trying to identify how sounds are made and associating the way that sounds are made with something vibrating. So as you can see from my picture, this is actually a pan of water that's been sat on top of an analogue speaker, and the ripples that are being made in the water is from the vibrations that are happening within the speaker as it generates sound. Then take a look at how those sound vibrations reach us, so how they travel through the air, through water, through whatever we are in, into our middle ear so that we can make sense of those noises. We'll also be looking to see if we can find patterns between the volume of a sound as it reaches our ear and the strength of the vibrations that created that sound. Hand you back to Mrs. Reed so she can tell you all about what we're going to be doing in history.
History is the study of the past, and specifically the people, societies and events of the past, and our attempts to help the children to understand them. This term we're going to be studying one of my favourite history units. It's a significant turning point in British history, and we look at World War II. By the end of this unit, the children will know the causes and consequences of World War II, how to order the key events of World War II on a timeline, 3 key figures from World War II and their political differences, the experiences of men, women and children in wartime Britain, experiences of the Blitz and evacuation, the effect of rationing on health and well-being, how propaganda was used to influence people, and the life of Anne Frank and how the Nazis treated people based on their beliefs. We will start by looking at why Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister at the time, declared war in 1939 because Germany invaded Poland. Next, we'll think about 3 important political figures of the time, and we'll discuss why their views were so very different. We'll find out what the Blitz is and why it must have been so dreadful living through such a terrible time. We'll also create some lovely artwork, just like the paintings on the right of the video. We'll think about different children's experiences of evacuation and whether they were going to have a better life or a worse life. What would you take with you if you had to leave home for months? We'll look into the effects of rationing on health and people's well-being, and we'll decide whether you think a wartime diet would have been healthier or less healthy than a diet nowadays. We'll look at lots of propaganda posters, and we'll decide how these could have been used to influence people's thoughts and lives. We'll finish off the unit by learning about a girl called Anne Frank. We'll learn about the diary that she wrote and how the Nazis treated people based on their different beliefs and religions. And finally, thank you for watching our video. Remember, if you need any support or further information on the units that we've outlined, you can email us at the address below, and of course you can always pop in to see us. Hope you enjoy.